Thank you for coming, and appreciate the local perspective from LA County. Many of your cities I know that you've either managed or worked for.
Right.
Been very involved in this issue. It might be a perfect match with the stormwater capture and reuse potential, so appreciate your comments. Okay, and so next up, Melinda Terry. I always think of you with forestry. Is that?
I used to be.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to mention that briefly as well, strangely enough.
You could talk into watersheds
Yeah.
maybe somehow. And you're going to talk about flood protection.
Yes, and thank you for inviting me. I thought I was going to be a little out of place with the other water stuff, but I'm actually finding common themes, which really have to do with Lester, I think, brought it up first.
Well, you have too much water.
Is costs of O&M is really expensive. I'm hearing these small disadvantaged, in our case, we just call them rural communities, but it's the same concept. And really just trying to address basic public safety and health. So I do think we end up fitting in. And I will say I put in here that we'd started in 1926. And one of the reasons I put that in there is, interestingly enough, my association was formed. We're the local levee maintainers in the Sacramento Valley and Delta. And we were formed back after the state reclamation board had tried to implement a fee in order to be able to bond and fund the construction of the levee projects. And the fee unfortunately did not work. They had a lot of problems, a lot of delinquencies because something called the Depression happened and other issues, so they ultimately abandoned the fee. So we formed in order to go ask Congress, could you help us build these levees? So kind of interesting. I will say I put in a slide in my presentation where just floods happen, and the point to just think about is the fact that really just like droughts, we get floods every 10 years. I'll just point out a couple of really important ones. Is 1986. The city of Sacramento really almost had to be evacuated, and they really just decided, let's see if Folsom Dam will hold, even though they're releasing more water than what it was designed for. The state was also sued, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. 1997 is another really important flood. Again, the next decade, you kind of notice the middle of the decade is when we tend to get our flood events. And that time we did have several levee failures. Over 9,000 homes were destroyed. We did have rooftop helicopter rescues, just like you saw in New Orleans in 2006, and over $1 billion in direct flood damages. And we also paid out liability lawsuits from that as well. Now, 2015, we're talking about El Nino coming, and the forecasts are that it's going to be as strong as that 1997, maybe stronger. Definitely Southern California is going to get hit, at a higher probability, I guess, for Northern now. Just keep in mind, too, if you look at just 2 decades worth on the next slide of the 80s and 90s, the 4 flood events that happened in those 2 decades was over $3 billion, worth of cumulative flood damages. So it really is expensive. For that 1986 lawsuit, because the states resisted paying for 21 years, it ended up, they settled for $464 million. They had a levee failure near this location in 97. They paid out immediately that time, I think, for $45 million. And the thing to keep in mind is after Katrina, the legislature did pass a lot of legislation, created the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which includes a 200-year level of protection mandate for urban areas. And I should have put in the word about, I don't know the exact amount, but let's say $5 billion. We have a deadline too, so it is going to require some state funding to do that. So think about that. The funding needs really is our state plan of flood control. It is the state systems. They own it. The locals are maintaining it for them, and I'm glad to say it's at a lower cost. But really it is a joint effort, though, of both the Flood Protection Board, DWR, and the local agencies working together. The federal government does not fund maintenance. So that's the thing. Again, going back to that high cost of O&M, it's on us, the state and the locals. The bonds, as Lester mentioned, also do not pay for O&M. The other thing, I'm representing Central Valley, but do keep in mind we do have statewide flood issues as Southern California experienced. So think about that as well. It's important to talk about the Central Valley though, because it is the state system, but there certainly are other responsibilities that you need to think about besides just state plan of flood control. Part of your problems that you're going to deal with fiscally is the fact that our state plan of flood control, we gave assurances to the federal government to maintain the levees to certain standards. We have not been funding them sufficiently to be able to do that, and so more than 70% is no longer eligible for federal funding. If we do have levee failures on those project levees, the federal government will come flood fight with us, but they will not repair. So the state is 100% responsible unless you can get Congress to pass a special bill. Also, when you have levee failures, as in the Paterno, you now have liability for the damage that is resulting from those failures. And of course, the funding needs are always the disaster response. If we've got El Nino, we've got a lot of costs that are going to go with that. The funding challenges are similar to what have been brought up here. We've got for us, it's running, the bond money is really waning. Prop 1E in '84 was a combined like $4 billion. But we're, down to the last billion, if you will. The liability, of course, that the state has for protecting 1.7 million acres. And the Prop 218 really can, limit you because it has to be proportional and it really can only be for flood. General benefits, are not allowed. And you also have to think about the competition sort of thing. I'll give the example where I live. I live in RD 900, Reclamation District 900. It is the levee maintainer. It has routine maintenance, has to do, and assesses me for that. Well, I also have the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, which really is the combined agencies trying to do the levee improvements, setback levees, slurry walls, big projects to improve the state plan of flood control system. And if you don't choreograph those correctly, you're competing. If one year voters vote for one flood thing for RD 900, if WASAFCA tries to come back the next time around, they're like, wait, I just paid for flood. Why am I being asked to pay again? So that gets really complicating. And federal funding, we had delay in federal funding for 7 years, the normal legislation they do. We've had flood insurance increases. And as I said, the state is no longer eligible for FEMA or Army Corps. The good news is with the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, we have really investigated. We know a lot about what's going on. And we are implementing the plan. The Flood Board also has a new encroachment program, which hopefully will, going forward, help them protect the integrity of the levees. The good news is the local agencies do at a much lower cost, and if the state had to maintain these 1,600 miles of levees yourself, it'd be a lot more expensive, so that's good news. Delta Subventions Program has been one of the most successful. DW is actually looking at using that model and expanding it statewide, if you will, to other levees. We've had less failures since that program's been in place. The Delta Protection Commission is conducting a feasibility study, but it's only feasibility. They're going to look at, but they'll look at other options for those other beneficiaries. So it'll be interesting to see whether we get just some good ideas out of that for you to think about. And of course, the bond funding that I talked about, we've had major work. And so the next slide after that shows some of the actual projects. We have achieved a lot, is the good news as we head into El Nino. The bad news is, I've already mentioned, we've more than 70% is no longer eligible. Even for our project levies that are eligible, that are in the rural areas, the Army Corps has a cost-benefit ratio that you have to pass. Most rural areas cannot pass that, so the state probably still is going to be 100% if we have a failure there. And the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan has identified a lot of long-term funding needs, but in the new Prop 1, there was only $395 million really towards what's called flood management, but $295 was for the Delta, $100 million was statewide. We've got 10 hydrologic regions statewide. They're supposed to somehow share that, and none was identified for the state plan of flood control specifically. And then I think I already mentioned the things to think about. The other thing I'll mention on the overlapping fee thing is I was reading an article the other day about the state fire fee. And that's what they're seeing is some of those local fire districts are having their assessments fail because the people are like, well, I just got billed for that, through that other thing. And so if we get some kind of Delta region-wide, like the DPC is looking at, or something else region that gets layered on, that choreography becomes critical because, again, under 218, we have to do a vote and they can and will say no. And the non-flood benefits, as I said, cannot be paid for. I'm going to skip over the El Nino effect and just go to the recommendations. Again, it's really important just investing. I think you can either pay now or pay later is the way to look at it. And so paying for that routine maintenance up front, I think really will help the state reduce the probability of those failures and the liability that goes along with that. But as we see after the flood events, first few years after that, the funding's really high. By the third, fifth year, it's gone down, dip, dip, dip. And until we get that next decade event, it goes back up again. And if we just had a little bit steadier, it'd be a little bit better. And then finally, I'll just say, just thinking ahead of El Nino, it'd be really nice to be just a little proactive through our Central Valley flood protection planning. I think we really have done a good job of maybe identifying some of the weakest links, if you will. So there are opportunities if, the state wants to think about immediately funding out ahead. The good news is once it starts happening, we do know also areas to really go up and shore up and protect. But there's a lot that could be done for the drainage and improving the stability of the levees ahead of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Melinda. And let's go on and talk a little bit about water infrastructure. And Xavier, please pronounce correctly your last name that I probably...
Ireas.
Ireas.
Ireas, yes.
Even though it has an I.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for inviting me to speak, Senator Pavley and Senator Wolk. I am the Director of Engineering for a major water utility, but today I'm here talking on behalf of ASCE. So I hope you have my handouts in front of you. So I'll talk a little bit about what ASCE is about, and then this thing, the report card on infrastructure, and then some of their policy positions. So ASCE is a very old engineering society of civil engineers. So that includes water and a lot of other things, and I'll focus on water today. Founded in 1852. And it's actually grown beyond its roots as an American society, so actually now it's in 177 countries and 150,000 members, mostly engineers, and 136,000 though of the members are in the USA. And it's gotten big enough, it's cut up into regions. There are 10 regions. California is so large that it gets its own region, so we're Region 9. And that's over 18,000 members in Region 9. So the mission of ASCE is, I'll kind of quote the main tagline of the mission statement. It's to provide essential value to our members and partners, advance civil engineering, and serve the public good. So it's that last part about serving the public good that prompted ASCE to make this thing called the report card that I'll talk about next. And certainly part of it, and it's mentioned on the slide under mission statement, is advocacy for things like infrastructure and environmental stewardship. And the report card is part of that mission. So the report card comes out in different versions, and so you might be confused when you read about one or another, so I thought I'd explain how that works. There's a national level report card. And then there's regional and state level ones. So you might actually see 3 different report cards, and they're issued in different years. The way they work is actually the national is the roll-up of the state or regional ones, and the state is a roll-up of sections of states. So in the case of Region 9, California, it's a roll-up of various counties as well as statewide systems within California. So in your packet, I included the National Report Card 2013. And I won't spend a lot of time on that. It does give the overall infrastructure across a variety of different sectors, including water. It gives us a D+, and it identifies literally trillions of dollars in infrastructure needs, 3.6 trillion. And that's a roll-up of course, the entire country. To drill down a little bit on California, that's your next slide. And by the way, you should have gotten a copy of that.
Yes, we do.
And I know it goes on for pages. It's not that daunting. There's also a little card that just gives you the bottom line. And there are more copies if you need either of those. But it's also shown on the slide. And so that's actually divided into maybe a more tractable list of sectors. It's 8 sectors. Water is shown at the bottom. And just for comparison, there are 2 columns, 2006 and 2012. And water stayed about the same. It was a C plus in 2006, and it drifted to a C in 2012. And you might be wondering about, what's the long-term history of this report card, and are the grades always C's and D's because there's always this kind of cry to action or something? And it's not necessarily the case. You can actually go to these websites that are shown here, and there are years when we enjoyed better grades. And certainly it could be worse than a C, but it could certainly be quite a bit better, and it has been better in the past. So the C, in summary, is something that is based on recognition. There are some significant gaps, some significant infrastructure needs, particularly looming out in the future. Not all of them are extremely obvious, and the report card is trying to make that clear. There is a slide that talks next about, well, where does the C come from? After the listing of what the grades are. So as I mentioned, it's a roll-up of regional report cards. So those regional report cards, for example, there's one for the San Francisco Bay Area and so on. It includes both urban and rural regions, but it doesn't capture necessarily all of the state's population. About 80% of the state's population is captured in one regional report card or another. So it captures that, and then it adds on needs that are identified at the federal, state, or major kind of multi-regional level, like metropolitan of Southern California. And then there is an estimate thrown on for the areas that are not explicitly represented. Those call it the other 20% of the population as an extrapolation. And that's how we come up with how many dollars. And we're considering, well, it's how many dollars, what are the needs to address a variety of areas? And there's a laundry list of them: reliability of supply, ability to store and distribute that water, seismic vulnerability, and the investments needed to reduce it, investments for security and safety, water quality, and that's of all communities, so that investment varies a lot by region, and the investment needed to grapple with the aging infrastructure. So the methodology, I think there might be a duplicate slide on your packet. I'll get to the kind of the highlights. First, the findings was that the Delta remains, quoting from the report card, the #1 water supply challenge, and calls out that significant funding will be needed at various levels of government to address that. And then moving beyond the Delta, looking statewide, the list of things that needs to be done, it's addressing the Delta, developing additional storage, both surface and groundwater, developing alternative treatment technologies, including desalination, promoting water use efficiency projects, including recycled water, promoting integrated regional water supply planning, supporting public education, and providing appropriate incentives for water use efficiency, and improving security against natural and man-made hazards. So those are the kinds of things that would be part of the investment that the report card is calling out. This is the kind of dollars we need. And the slide in front of you now, I hope if you're flipping along with me, itemizes, well, what are these dollars? And there is kind of a nationwide number you would have heard that's a very large number, and that's in the literally over $100 billion, but zeroing in on California, which is what's shown in the table on your slide, it calls for an estimated $46 billion over a 10-year period. So it is a forward-looking report card. What will it take to address the situation we see now in our infrastructure? And so that comes out to $4.6 billion a year. And I mention that because if you square this with, well, what are people spending now and so on, that's not necessarily what we're driving at here. We're looking at, well, what's the condition of the pipe in the street, of the dam that's sitting out there right now? What would it take to bring it to an acceptable level? And then 10 years is a reasonable horizon to do that. So that's how you come up with an annualized cost. It may not track with what you spent last year or the year before. So that's what it boils down to, is $4.6 billion a year. And It includes some of the big things I mentioned, like the delta improvements. It specifically carves out levees as their own itemization. The $11 billion in non-levy delta work. And the lion's share is actually regional projects. It's based on those regional report cards. 32 billion of the 46 is at regional scale. And this, by the way, this compares with $4 billion per year in 2006. So just incrementally worse in terms of how much of an investment. That's what the report card says. It's kind of saying, here's what you need, and it doesn't necessarily spell out how to get there, but I did include a final slide, which is kind of paraphrasing a written statement from ASCE Region 9, policy positions relevant to water. So I kind of tried to boil them down. There is a longer typewritten version, but I'll rattle through the top ones in very paraphrased form. And the ASCE policy, it recommends emphasizing water supply reliability, accounting for climate change. And I think as I run through these, you'll find out other speakers today have already talked about many of these. Enhancing regional sustainability, supporting funding based on beneficiary pays principles, supporting sustainable groundwater management, supporting integrated regional water management, maximizing existing storage, and providing additional storage where needed. And what that refers to is things like rethinking our operations of reservoirs, for example, conjunctive use, things like that, storage that already exists in some fashion. Supporting increased water use efficiency to meet and exceed the 20 by 2020, expanding recycled water usage, promoting and subsidizing alternative technologies such as desal, and managing flood control systems to maximize capture and recharge. So that's a very quick overview of where we think we are with our infrastructure and some of the right directions to address it. And that's all I had for today. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's not a glowing report card. But, room for improvement.
Critically underfunded.
Critically underfunded. So thank you for walking us through that. Let's hear from Brian Strenko, Director of California Water Program from the Nature Conservancy. So I'm guessing perhaps watersheds or something?
Maybe
like that?
something like that.
Okay.
I figured I could say ditto, but that wouldn't be very satisfying. Well, first of all, thanks for having me and for putting on this hearing. Completely important issues. I will drill down into the specific issues related to freshwater species and the environment and the funding gaps associated with that. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that there is funding that goes towards the environment, our freshwater species. And I can say on behalf of my environmental colleagues, we appreciate that. Without that funding, we probably wouldn't have some great things we have here in California, like a really nice and blue Lake Tahoe. Could it be bluer? Sure, but it's beautiful. And we have a great coastline. We have great forests and all the recreational and tourism benefits we derive from all of that. But the condition of our species in dramatic decline in only the last few decades indicates to us that it's not enough. And we also should recognize that the way we've developed our water system and managed it in the last 200 years has actually caused some substantial harm to the environment. Therefore, we should consider how to fund improvements for the environment as part of our overall water system investments. I also would suggest that there's some really cool stuff going on right now in water and the environment that we can look to advance solutions for the future. You take a look at the Shasta Valley, for instance, and you have ranchers who regularly forego irrigation to benefit salmon. In the Central Valley, we have rice farmers who provide benefits to migratory birds. We have vineyard operators who forego water use so that steelhead are protected in hot summers. So we have a lot of great things going on. The problem with it is they're just little pieces. They're pilot projects. They're experiments. They're just tinkering. And what we need to do is get beyond the tinkering and really move to a system-wide rejuvenation of how we deal with water and the environment. These pilot projects, these experiments are pointing the way. They show the opportunity we have, but it's going to take substantial funding to get us to where we really need to be. So really I'll point out 3 specific categories that I feel are very important. The first, surprise, surprise, is stewardship and maintenance, or O&M. The second is data collection and monitoring. And the third is research and innovation. And well, let's start with stewardship and maintenance. It's obvious we've all talked a lot about how we need to maintain things. Well, if you're specifically buying land or getting conservation easements to protect the environment, you're going to have costs associated with maintaining the land and working it sometimes and managing it. And those costs are, we've seen, for instance, the state park situation and how little money we have for operation and maintenance, and then therefore the degradation that occurs on those lands. Well, state parks aren't the only things we have that need that. We have wildlife refuges, preserves, we have open space in local areas, and we actually have working farms and ranches that require maintenance to be compatible with wildlife needs. So it's an important investment that needs to be made. And right now, for instance, we, the Nature Conservancy, we actually set aside endowments at the time of purchase of the easement or a land that gives us the confidence that we'll be able to maintain these lands ongoing. But it tends to be about 10% of the overall fair market value of a property. That's a lot of money. And we're lucky because we have the resources to be able to do that. A lot of the organizations, agencies, NGOs who take care of these lands don't have the luxury of doing that. And then in addition, we have to recognize the benefits we derive for our water system from our open space, our lands. One is we can often conduct research that's really important when we own something towards a solution, separate and apart from when we don't own something. So we get our solutions from these places on the ground. And then also we actually are protecting areas that are in and around our water system. So we're benefiting our rivers, our streams, our wetlands. So for all those reasons, stewardship and maintenance funding is important. Data collection and monitoring. This one really gets me riled up. If you don't measure something, you cannot manage it. And this is absolutely the case with our water system. Lester actually mentioned earlier the decline in U.S. Geological Survey instruments, stream gauges, that we have. We had just almost 10 years ago, we had 1,500 that were sending information to the web real time, active in California. Today we have 400, and we've had one of the driest periods in our history. And while we should be looking to the federal government to pay for some of our water stuff, for sure, we have to accept the fact that if we're not getting the money, we're going to have to start measuring ourselves. And when we do that, what we've been able to see is that when we're able to measure pretty precisely stream flow, as well as water use in an area, and then get specific about fish and wildlife's water needs, we can actually do a lot better job of balancing across human and natural systems. So this information is vital to making that happen. The third area, of course, is research and innovation. I mentioned all these little experiments, these pilot projects, if you will. It tends to be the case that public funding does not support the innovative projects that are toying with a solution to a real problem that we might have. I'll give you an example. One is we've been trying to balance water for salmon and water for ranches in the Shasta Valley now for over a decade. And one of the solutions we've found is that we can actually lease water from ranchers for like two weeks or 4 weeks. So they forego their irrigating, water goes in the stream, salmon can migrate. Really nice, elegant solution. Doesn't actually cost a ton, but you need funding that's flexible enough to just have that periodic investment instead of be tied to a 20-year timetable or something. Really important, that flexibility for innovation. Another example is where we're now looking to our Sierra Nevada, and we all know this is where our snowpack comes from. It's the source of our water. How can we research or design research to tell us what the best scenarios for managing our forests are? Really important stuff, often not able to be funded from a public source. And then finally, I'll just say that when we do have solutions, like in the ranching example, or in the example where rice farmers are actually helping out migratory birds, we're providing solutions that help the economy and the environment. And if you go to one of these farmers or one of these ranchers, and you ask them about their work, one of the first things they're going to tell you about is how prideful they feel about what they're able to do for their livelihood, but also for the species in and around where they live. So with that, I'll thank the committee one more time and just point out once again that the three categories that I see that are really needed for the environment: stewardship and maintenance, data collection and monitoring, and research and innovation. I feel strongly that we can be confident that if we do fill these gaps, that we will be able to find the solutions necessary for balancing water for nature and water for people in this state. But it's going to take making the investment, not only from the experiments, but all the way up to making sure the solutions are adopted at a wide scale. Thank you.